again. Welcome. Today we have Gemma, an educational psychologist.
She works with families and schools to help our children feel more comfortable in their educational settings. Gemma, hi.
Hi.
Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
I think the question we need to ask firstly is, what is an educational psychologist?
It's fantastic. It's a fantastic question. And I actually think I'm not asked that enough.
Mm-hmm.
So people will often come into meetings with me and actually not really understand why we're having a meeting or why I'm in school. So I'm a psychologist and I specialise in working with children and young people.
Yeah.
And what I always say to families, and actually to young people as well, is my role, my aim is to try and make learning easier and education more enjoyable. And that's what I'm trying to do. And we do that in lots of different ways.
And is it just with children with special needs, or is it?
It can be with all children. So it really varies. If we're doing individual work with children and young people, it does tend to be those with some kind of additional need. Okay. But it might be that actually that hasn't been identified what that need is.
So how does one know if they need you?
Absolutely.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
like,
absolutely.
It's great that you're there and what you do I'm sure is fantastic. But how would I know, or someone that I need an educational psychologist
or known as an ed-psych.
Ed-psych or EP.
EP.
I will probably start using EP a lot. So
Fine.
that's what I mean.
So how does one know that I need to have one?
Absolutely. Usually for most families, it will be in discussion with a nursery or a school. So they will be the first people to flag to you that actually perhaps your child is struggling to learn or finding it hard to manage their feelings or make friends at nursery or at school, and that they've tried out some ways to help, but they would like some more advice from other professionals to help them. So that's the most typical way you might find out. And it might be that your child therefore is known to like the SENCO, so the special needs coordinator in a nursery or school. And again, that's usually our liaison person in those settings.
So with Callie, we've already had an ed-psych that came to the school. Amazing. And it was through it was for the EHCP process. And I didn't really know what she was doing. And if I'm all honest with you, even though we've had an ed-psych, I know you just told us, but I didn't actually really understand what the role was for an ed-psych. I thought it was more to help towards finalising an EHCP and putting strategies and IEPs and all those words that I'm learning as being a SEN mum to put in place.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, so one of our roles is part of exactly what you just described and you experienced. So in the law around special educational needs, if you apply for an education, health and care plan, then one of the pieces of advice that you will have is psychological advice, and that is in the law. And that means that local authorities will have access to educational psychologists. They'll employ them or commission them to provide assessments, and that's what you experienced.
Okay, so Jade, for you then, if you're going through your EHCP process now, have you been in touch with the nursery, or have they been in touch with you to just say they're bringing in an ed-psych? Because I feel like you've not mentioned that.
I've had someone come in and shadow her. I don't know if they're assessing her, but I know they're observing her. But that, I think, was towards her diagnosis.
So I think that's an early years practitioner, because that's what Callie had when she was at nursery. And then it was at the school that the ed-psych came.
Maybe they don't. Maybe they're not doing it yet because she's only 3. She's at nursery still, and I haven't applied for the EHCP yet. We're just in the process of it.
Yeah,
maybe you apply for it first, and then they bring people out.
So the stage that an educational psychologist would become involved is after you've applied for an EHCP, and the local authority has agreed to do an assessment.
Fine.
Then there'll be a period of time where an EP would be involved usually. Having said that, for some families, they do get involved earlier, and some schools and nurseries might call them in before that stage, because we do work before EHCPs as well.
So what should one expect when you come in?
Depends on the child. It depends on the setting. But there is a sort of
Are you there to give, not a diagnosis, sorry to interrupt, but are you there to help along the process, or are you there to say, right, your kid needs this, this and this, or doesn't?
Yeah.
What can I as a parent, or anyone as a parent, a SEN parent, expect from having someone like yourself coming in?
Yeah.
What's the benefits?
So I would say, and I say this when I meet with parents, there are 3 outcomes that I'm aiming for, and it can be 1, 2, or 3 of those. So firstly, we want you to go away with, and us to go away with, a shared understanding of your child. So what that means is that's the sort of assessment part of it. It's what are your child's strengths? What are your child's differences? How do they learn differently, communicate differently, regulate differently? And let's agree with like the nursery or the school and yourself and the professionals what their strengths and differences are. The second thing would be, okay, so how are we going to support them? What are their support needs? So you should come away with ideas for yourself sometimes at home, or particularly for them in a nursery or school context, because that is our focus, of ways in which they might need support. And then the third outcome might be that we signpost you to different professionals.
Fine.
And that might be because actually you're not on a diagnostic pathway at all yet. It's really early intervention work, and I'm the first professional to be involved, and you've never heard of autism and ADHD before, but I'm letting you know that maybe you need to go along a diagnostic path.
Looking into more of the emotional side of that must be, you've got a tough job, because I even remember we already had the diagnosis. We already had our school place. We very much knew that Callie is autistic and globally delayed, but I still do remember, and I met the ed psych about 6 months ago, I sobbed throughout, because you're telling me how my child stands out, whether it's the good or bad, but their differences. And we may not see a lot of those differences because they may be very different at home than they are in an educational setting. So I just remember it being a very emotional roller coaster meeting. And that must be really tough for you are you a mum yourself?
I am, yes.
Okay, so being a mum yourself as well, understanding that the parents are receiving a hell of a lot of information in one of these meetings, no offence to the school, in an uncomfortable environment. You're put in a small classroom. There's the Senko there, the teachers, the ed psych, the parents.
Usually
it's daunting.
sitting on a child's chair.
Yes.
Oh, yes.
And a tiny table as well. It's just a daunting experience. Like, it's not, I know the whole process is daunting, but you must deal with a lot of parents' emotions.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think they can be, particularly if school and parents are having different experiences of a child. And what I will always say is I start with that. I'm like, that's okay. We're different in different environments. We don't need to be the child doesn't need to be the same in different environments.
Definitely Bailey Bo is different in different environments, because the stuff that she does at nursery is way more advanced than what she'd ever do with me at home.
What does she do today, Jade? Let everyone know.
She ate a tuna mayo cracker.
She wouldn't go anywhere near tuna at home, would she?
And yet she still wouldn't. And that's why I find it so difficult to understand my child.
Yeah. Because actually, when they're with different people, when they're in different sensory environments, when there are different expectations on them, and especially if they're not yet of an age where they can articulate why they might be able to show some skills in some environments and not in others, that can make it really hard for us to understand. So I always say that to parents, I've been in plenty of meetings before where parents are saying they're really struggling at home, and the school's like, we don't see it, particularly if they're highly
I think that's
masking.
really difficult for parents as well.
Yeah. That is highly masking, isn't it? They mask at school a lot.
Sometimes, absolutely. And so it's about saying, great, fantastic, let's learn from your experiences at home.
Do you come home and see a home setting, or do you only ever go into the school?
It varies. Usually it's one or the other.
Okay.
Typically we would only go to the home, or I would only visit home if a child's not in an educational setting.
But you prefer to see them in an educational setting?
That's because we're educational psychologists.
That's very true.
That tends to be what we prioritise. It's not always possible. I've done home visits.
The home visits usually that either a child is refusing to go to school or there is no school placement for them, that you would tend to go to the home.
Yeah, I'd say they're unable to go to school rather than necessarily refusing.
Fine.
But they're unable to go to school at that point in time.
Yeah.
Or absolutely they haven't got a school placement, or very occasionally with early years children as well. They're not yet statutory age.
They're not there long enough for. So as a parent ourselves, how would you say we can prepare for you?
For the HCP visit, or for what I'd say a different kind of...
Probably for the visit of the EHCP. Let's make it a bit more about me.
Absolutely. That's what you're the stage where you're going through at the moment.
Yeah.
That's
so how would I prepare for you to come into my nursery? I've just sent off my EHCP and the next step is, would I contact you, or
No, so you should hear, so from an EHCP process, if the local authority assign an educational psychologist, then they will get in touch with you.
And how do I prepare for that?
So they will...
Not that I can prepare my child for it.
Well, no, possibly not at the age and stage that they're at, but we can talk about how older children are prepared for it as well, because we do recommend that. But I'd say as a parent, it's about coming in ready to talk about your child and ready to think about what are their strengths, what are the things that they can do well, and actually that's something that personally I always like to start with, and you see a look in parents' faces as well when I ask that. I say, tell me about your child on their best day. Mm-hmm. I want to know when things are going well. I want to know what environments they're thriving in, because I've read the paperwork. I know that they might, if they've already had a diagnosis, they don't often get to talk about that.
Yeah.
They've had to write EHCP forms filled with the worst day.
Yeah.
But actually now it's like, right, we want to learn. We want to learn how to support this child and what's going to make a difference for them. And so really using what we call like strength-based kind of psychology and questions, that's what we want to know about. So don't be surprised when we want to know about the best things, about how they do communicate or how they do calm down, what helps you calm them down when they're upset, all those sorts of things. Yeah. Don't be afraid to ask questions. Like this can be a two-way conversation like this is now, you know, ask the EP questions as well about your child. If there are things you're wondering about, you know.
Do you always find though, Soph, like when you have these conversations, you go home and you're like, damn it, I should have asked that.
Yeah. And that's why I think Gemma's saying as well, especially if people
write them down.
Write them down.
Yeah.
But one thing that I'm going to be negative.
Yeah, go for it.
Sorry.
It's okay.
Because I've been there.
Yes.
So I don't know if all EPs do things differently, but the way it worked for us was the EP went to Callie's classroom first, observed her. Yeah. After the observation, the parents came into the meeting. Yeah. Now, I don't know how long the observations are, but say they are even 2 hours, which is probably a very long time. That's 2 hours out of 5.5 years that you see a child. Yeah. And I remember with my ed psych, she said to me, oh, she can sit for 5 minutes. And the Senko immediately will be like, no, she can't. And she's like, but I've just seen her. Yeah, but she was playing with dollies. So she was, you know, and I think I feel that's what's really difficult, if, as you were saying about prep, is make sure you write these things down beforehand, because ultimately your report goes towards the EHCP. Yeah. So if it says that she can sit for 5 minutes, then she may not require some additional help there because the ed psych has seen it. I'm not being negative. I'm just saying, do you listen to a parent or a Senko to say, you know what, actually, I know you've seen that today, but it's usually not the case.
100%. So one of the things I ask after every observation that I will do of a child is I'll go over to the teacher, the teaching assistant, the parent, and I'll say, was that a typical day? And more often than not, they will say, absolutely not. I can't believe he's just sat there and completed this work, and played with the dolls for 5 minutes, whatever it is.
He's actually played ball when you don't need him to.
Yeah. He spoke to a friend, whatever it was. They're like that. They have this sixth sense that someone's come in and visiting them, that there's someone in the classroom, and that does change things.
Yes, it does.
That's okay, because for me an observation is, I think of my job as a bit like a jigsaw puzzle. So the assessment for me is not the observation. The assessment is everything from that first phone call with you, reading through the paperwork. When I'm observing, I'm looking to see, is there evidence of the things that are in the paperwork, but also what am I seeing that's different to that? How can I help understand this child? So actually, if they noticed that she was sitting for 5 minutes and then you clarified that because she was with the dolls and that was her favourite toy, and that day, I don't know, the loudest children in the classroom were out doing a PE lesson at the same time, and great. Okay, so we know that she can sit for 5 minutes when she's with her favourite toys and when the environment is supportive for her. Yeah. And that's what needs to get written about her.
Got you.
So that is how we use the word triangulate our evidence. That's the sort of psychology term.
So it's not basically just from one visit.
No, it's really not.
A load of different things.
Because
that can actually be quite detrimental and actually quite dangerous. I mean, in the nicest possible way.
But I remember, and I don't know if it's the same as a usual process, but, you know, as I mentioned before, I had a couple of people on social media say, I've got an ed psych appointment next week. Please give me advice. I went back and met the ed psych again. Is that, was it, I don't know, I can't remember because I seem to be able to just put things behind me. Was that, I don't know why, because it was a difficult meeting, but I know it's only to help my child. Is this to then, I think this was when the report came through and then we went through the report. And I remember that's when the Senko or the teacher would say, actually, I think we need to alter this or edit this. Yeah. So is it usual for the parent to go back?
How often does a parent see you?
Again, it will differ from how differ from how I'm working now, because that's the other thing. Now I'm working privately. I'm not doing these EHCP type assessments anymore.
Yes, that's a shame.
As of recently.
So you were working for the LA?
Years. So I worked for the local authority for over 10 years. Yeah. So that's where the most of my experience has come in, and I've now chosen to work privately. So I actually do quite different work. How does that work?
Because you can't. You can't do that for EHCPs privately, can you? Or you had to give that part of it up?
No, so parents can commission private educational psychologists to provide evidence for EHCP
So it's an additional report to give.
So it can be additional.
But they would still need to have the LA one?
It depends on the local authority.
Okay.
Sometimes they will accept the psychological advice from someone else. It really is, it varies. Or sometimes their advice will look different.
Difficult and baffling and
so much information.
I've
got no idea
because there's not one route for each family. It's not like you can say to a parent, right, this is what's going to happen.
And it's not every child's the same.
Yeah.
So every child's going to need different support and different everything.
But the process is similar, but we use different tools, have different types of meetings. Coming back to your question about how often a parent would meet, typically it might only be once. It might be a couple of times. It might be that there's a review after 6 months. It might be at a future annual review if you have an EHCP. We're not therapists, though, in the sense of offering that ongoing regular support.
Mm-hmm. Okay, because you're educational.
Because we're educational psychologists. And so that might look different to other professionals, is that we might kind of dip in and out of a child's life over the time that they're in education.
Okay, so put aside like EHCPs. Yeah. What else do you offer as a EP?
Yeah. So a lot of the work that I do now is actually direct with schools. So schools buy me in to offer early intervention support. So actually this is usually before an EHCP is being discussed. As I mentioned, it might be before there's been diagnoses, but it's when...
They've just had concerns.
They've had concerns. But it might also be that it's not just a specific individual child. So if I'm working with a school, I work closely with the Senko, and they might say, you know what, we've got a really tricky class. You know, this particular class is really struggling with coming in from break times and settling down for their learning. Like, would you mind popping in and observing and giving us some thoughts around that?
Because so they hire you to come and help them.
Which I actually love. Is this mainstream settings or specialists?
No, mainstream
See, I love
schools.
that. I know that lots of people dig at mainstream schools, that they can't cope with send children, but actually I still feel that mainstream schools do a lot and everything they can to support their children in the school.
I think it depends what school it is.
Yes.
Not all schools.
It does vary. But I'd like to think in the schools that I work with that they're trying to do their best within the resources
and I don't also
that they
think
have.
It's their fault fully, because the children maybe are put in their school when maybe they shouldn't be, but they have to deal with it and cope with it. It's not always the school's fault.
Yeah,
does that make sense?
Wide system. There's lots of factors. There's lots of factors at play as to, you know, how successfully a child is being included or what that classroom is like.
Their individual needs as well. Some children might cope and some children might not. So,
but the work that I love the best with those schools is actually the training. So that's what I'm doing a lot of now. Is training for teachers and staff. Training them. So I do a lot of work now with helping schools and classrooms become what I call more neurodivergent affirming, so more autistic friendly or more supportive of neurodivergent children and young people. So actually, can they create environments that are going to support all children's needs?
Because that's interesting to hear that, because I recently asked the teacher whether she's told the class that Callie's autistic, because I recently had a message from a mum saying she didn't want to be that mum, but she was that mum, and she told me about an incident that my child did, which absolutely, by the way, it was a week ago and I can't get it out of my head because it's so devastating as a parent to hear anything like that when you're worrying about a million other things.
I just think it was the way it was dealt with.
It was just a shame, but it is what it is. But I said, are you as teachers educating the pupils? And I know they're young, they're year one, and I know obviously she was in reception. She said to me, in reception, right at the beginning, they informed that Callie can do whatever she wants. If she wants to play in the back and everyone else is sitting down, it's okay. And I know kids are very accepting anyway, and I don't think they ask many questions. They might ask their parents, but I don't think they ask the teachers. And she said since then we haven't needed to. But she still sits in a corner on her own with a one-to-one, has her own desk. She's segregated. Is that the right word?
Segregated.
Well done, me. From the others.
I think when they get a bit older, they might get a bit more.
But is that what you're also trying to help with teachers, the way that they're meant to
approach
these conversations? Absolutely. So a school, that's a really good example of where actually we can be really helpful in a school, because a teacher can sit down with us and actually say, right, I know that I need to be having a conversation with my class about the different needs within the classroom, and I'm not quite sure how I'm going to do this. What resources can we use? Because there are some increasingly fabulous resources for schools to talk about neurodivergence.
So funny you mention this, because I was just working before, and someone came up to me in the salon and was like, how do you explain to people that Bailey's different, like to your kids? How do you explain, like, if she goes to nursery or something like that, to explain to the other children? And I was like, just that she's slightly different, and that she's, her needs are different, and you might need to communicate with her differently. But they said, like, they would love some sort of book, like a reading book that they could read to their children, to let their children understand how other children are different.
Yeah.
I don't think there's enough of that. And maybe that's fantastic. That's what you're bringing in.
Yeah, I think there's increasingly resources that support those conversations.
I definitely have a radar since my daughter's diagnosis.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. I feel you on that.
There's a fabulous program called LEANS. It's from, I think it's University of Edinburgh. LEANS can point you to. I mean, it's designed for schools, but it is about creating more, as I say, neuroaffirming and understanding schools. I think there are increasingly books for parents that we can read about the brain and about understanding how the brain works. But at its simplest, that's exactly as you responded, is how I would respond. I would say everyone learns differently. Everyone communicates differently.
There's no right or wrong way.
Absolutely.
Just a different
But I
way.
also like the fact that people are asking you. They ask me as well, because it means that they genuinely care, and they want to know the best way that they can
support you as a
vocalize
friend.
it to it. Yeah, to support and to share with their children.
Absolutely. And the more you get to know about your children, about your girls, you can share with them and say, well, actually, this is what we know. This is how they're going to, whether it's, come into a birthday party, that's what's going to be easiest for them, or sit at the table or on a play day, or have these particular toys available or this particular food available, whatever it might be. Yeah. You can let them know.
I think the difficult bit, especially I know obviously Bailey's a lot younger than Callie, but I think what's difficult is that parents and teachers can share with their pupils about Callie or other children that are on the spectrum, but I'm not able to share that with Callie yet. There is no way I could say, Callie, you've got autism.
Yeah.
It should be just dancing and spinning away and doing whatever she wants. Yeah. And I think that's really hard that
would she not say to you, what's autism?
No, the only questions that she's ever asked me is why do I have Callie's corner in the classroom? Okay. So now I think there's things, but I think it's really hard that, I think sad as a mum that the people are being educated, but then the child that it's being educated about doesn't have a clue. Yeah. I think that's tough too.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's all tough.
Yeah. Because telling her about her autism, you'll know when it's the right time.
Yeah, it's
because she'll start asking the right questions, or just showing you signs that she wants to understand more. Yeah. Or not. Yeah. Or not. But you still might choose to share that information in a way. Even if you don't know how they're going to understand and respond to it. Yeah. And in the meantime, actually just talking about any difference. Mm-hmm. You could start talking to her about the colour of hair. Yeah. Or what she likes compared to what her siblings like.
I'm also currently teaching her that she does a swimming session, and there's a boy that's non-verbal, and she says, I love him, he's my best friend. And I said, and he doesn't have a voice. He can't say words, he only makes noises. Yeah. So I'm not going into detail, but I'm just saying, and she can understand that. So it's just, as you said, finding the right time, and when it is the right time, then absolutely, that will happen.
Absolutely.
So what you really do, I feel, is quite a specific, what's the word? Not genre, it's quite a specific thing that you do. So how does one get into that? How did you get into
what's your background?
Really? Because it's quite a,
Niche.
Yes,
I
that's the
suppose.
word. Thank
Yeah.
you, niche.
So I studied psychology at uni, and I just knew I wanted to work with children. I know it sounds kind of cheesy to say, but I think you just know. Some people just know that. Maybe it's because I was the oldest sibling, oldest cousin in the family.
Yeah.
You know, it's just where my interest lay. And straight out of uni, I joined a friend who'd also was interested in a similar field, and we'd both got a job at a national autistic school.
Wow.
And
Did you always know it wanted to be children with disabilities?
Not necessarily, no. I mean, once I'd specialised in once I sort of got my degree in psychology, I thought it might be, but I didn't know that autism would become a particular area of interest for me, which it is.
Or how big it is.
Or how big, I had no idea. And I worked as a teaching assistant and care worker because it was a residential school. So I was also there in the evenings and the mornings, and I had no idea what I was doing. Like, you know, walked in day one. I think they gave you 2 days training at the beginning, and it was like, off you go.
Wow.
And it was really grounding experience, actually. And I still look back at it now and just think, because the children who were there were all autistic, all had learning disabilities, and all had challenging behaviour. And many of them were in residential care. So it was very complex needs.
What age was that?
Went from 4 to 14.
Wow,
Did
4, so young.
Yeah.
Residential meaning they stay over there.
So some of the children would stay there Monday to Friday, and some would stay there 52 weeks.
Wow.
Do they still do that sort of thing?
Yeah, those placements do exist for a small number of children where those support needs are so high.
Yeah.
It must be such a like, I can't even explain the feeling for a parent, knowing that you can't meet your child's needs and you can't be there for them, but knowing that you're like giving them away because you know it's for the best, and I know you can still see them, but the guilt.
I suppose
I just
maybe it's about thinking of it as meeting their needs differently.
Yeah,
You are meeting their needs by recognising that.
I feel like it would just, for me, that made me almost feel like I've failed, even though it's not
I understand
our faults.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And those are strong feelings to have to live with. Absolutely.
I actually just got told recently that my grandpa was an educational psychologist.
Oh, wow.
Yes, and he had his own autism unit in Leeds.
Amazing.
And I just remember in the last few years, until he passed, that he was so invested into Callie, but I didn't know why, because it was before we even knew there was anything wrong, but he knew.
Yeah.
And because he's from Leeds, he used to say, send me videos. So I just used to send him the videos, but he was trying to work her out.
Yeah.
But it's just like, you know how we said that we've got the DAR?
Yeah.
You must very much have the DAR. You just must know.
Yeah. And I think that's where the interest came from as well, because what I realised working with these children, young people, I was like, I want to understand why, and I need to understand more about how they communicate. They are communicating,
be in their
but
little
it's
brains.
not. Exactly. And that's where my science background came in. That's, you know, when people say like, how do EPs work, even if every child is different, we're still following a similar path for each one. So in our minds, we're saying, right, what are the concerns? What are the questions that need to be answered about this child? Where am I going to get that evidence from? What's that evidence going to look like?
I suppose the questions are still the same, but the answers are different.
Yeah, absolutely.
So tell me about a cognitive assessment.
Yes.
Does
Good question, Jade.
Does everyone need one of them?
No.
How does that work?
Absolutely
And
not.
explain what that is.
What is it? Heard of an IQ test?
Yes.
No.
Okay.
What? An IQ test?
IQ
Yes,
test.
of course.
I was going to say, were you tricking us with that answer?
No, that's fine. So a cognitive assessment is what we used to call an IQ test.
Fine.
Okay. But we usually report them quite differently to maybe how they used to be thought of. And they are a way of trying to understand how a person is thinking and learning. And they are usually a set of activities appropriate for the child's age, usually not done before 6 at the youngest, maybe. There are some early years assessment tools that some people use.
So
but
one
it's
isn't
less
needed
common.
for an EHCP?
No, it's not. It's not. Certainly at this, certainly not at the age of your children.
Yes, fine.
And not for all types of needs. Where it might be needed for an EHCP is if the concerns are specifically around learning needs.
Fine.
So that may or may not run alongside autism, ADHD, but actually if we're specifically exploring sort of learning differences, then that might be helpful. But just like I said before, it's one piece of the jigsaw puzzle. So a cognitive assessment, how a child sits down and performs with me one-to-one when they're doing these activities, isn't how they're learning in the classroom. It's like one piece of that puzzle and I'm putting the pieces together.
Yeah.
I'm pleased that you see it like that and that you don't just fall for it that maybe they're masked it that day. And
No, it's reassuring actually.
Because actually if they can do something with me, I'm like, great, how are we going to replicate it in the classroom? If they can't do it with me, why not? What was the support they had there that they didn't have with me?
Yeah.
And so those are the questions I'm asking.
I put on my Instagram a couple of weeks ago when Bailey Bow had her speech and language therapist go into the nursery and she started saying hi, 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 and she was copying what Jodie was saying. And God, I've tried it every day since.
It's unbelievable because she hasn't had...
And not once has she done that with me. Yeah. But it's obviously the setting was different. She obviously looks at Jodie very differently how she looks to me. Maybe there was no TV on or there was no distractions because it was just the three of them in a room. Yeah. So all of that, I suppose, is different as well. So it's how can we basically bring that home? Yeah,
absolutely. And I think that's part of that conversation that then happens as part of the assessment where we bring together the teacher, the parents, the teaching assistant, anyone else who's involved. The more of us in the room, the better, in my view, because actually the more different bits of the puzzle that we have that we can put together and say, what is the whole picture for this child? And what are you doing that's working well? What am I doing that's working well? And what can we try and replicate?
Do parents ask you, and are you able to answer? Would parents say, is he autistic? Does he have ADHD? Does he have dyslexia? And how do you answer that?
They ask me all the time.
I'm sure we would too, wouldn't we?
So as an educational psychologist alone, I cannot diagnose autism or ADHD. So I can work as part of a multidisciplinary team to do that if I have the right qualifications. So I am trained, for example, in doing the ADOS, which is part of an autism assessment. Yeah. And so there's a paediatrician that I work with and we can do that. But alone, if I'm doing an EP assessment, I can't diagnose that. What I might say is probably firstly, I'll say, why are you asking me that question and what are you thinking? And try and understand, because you mentioned before about it being emotional for the parents. I want to gauge where they're at on their journey.
Yeah. But they obviously have an instinct if they're asking.
They're asking. Sometimes there only one parent is and the other's not as well. And I'm in a meeting with both of them. So I need to kind of sense where they're at together.
Feel the room. Read the room.
Read the room. There's a lot of that. There's a lot of that in our job.
I can imagine.
All the time.
I'm definitely not good at reading a room.
So, and then I might say, these are the things that I've noticed. If they're asking me, if I've already done the observation, I'll say, these are the things that I've noticed. If you would like to understand more about those, then you might want to do a diagnostic assessment. If it's an older child, I'll include also what the young person thinks as well. Yeah. If it's something like dyslexia, though, that is what I'd call a specific learning difference or difficulty. Dyslexia, which is to do with reading, dyscalculia, to do with numbers. And those we can diagnose if we've done a full assessment. Okay. So again, if I get asked that question, if I'm then working with the child or young person, I might be able to.
Is it common to have dyslexia or dyscalculia? If you have other additional needs, or can you just have them completely without any other diagnosis?
So all of these diagnoses and labels can be standalone. Yeah. And more commonly than not, though, there are overlaps. Now, you might not meet the diagnostic threshold for other learning differences, but you probably have some traits, maybe. Okay. Depending on the child. So there's often a lot of overlap.
So is that something that I might just think in the future we may get some sort of other diagnosis for, or not necessarily at all?
I think it comes back to is that a barrier to their learning, their development and their progress? Yeah. If we've got all the other supports in place and a child is still not making progress, then we have to say, well, what else is going on, right? So then it might become relevant. Yeah. Or it might not be needed. Yeah.
Fair enough. Do you ever get it wrong?
I think
bold question.
That is a
very bold.
Do we ever get it wrong?
Obviously, I know you don't do it on purpose. Or
I'd like to think we're getting it right for that moment in time. Yeah.
Well, you can only really go on an hour's observation and what the parents have written in the report.
I can spend half a day with a child if I'm meeting with them one-to-one. I might have reviewed them, but it's still a snapshot in time. It's still what they're doing now. What I'm writing is what they can do now. Next week, if they walk into the room and say, hi, that's going to be different to what I wrote in the week before. Yeah. So I'd like to think that we are doing the best in the moment that we can, but that a child's needs change over time.
Yeah.
And all the time, which is why it doesn't necessarily a one-off.
So would it be fair to say that like an annual review would make sense or not necessarily?
Not necessarily. I mean, an annual review of their needs, but between you and the school setting.
Fine.
So you wouldn't
Absolutely. You wouldn't need an EP every year. No. But there might be certain points where you think actually the needs have changed quite a lot and we would like an updated professional view on those.
Fair enough.
Sometimes it's helpful to think of moments before transition.
Yes.
So year 5 is often a good point.
Yeah.
Or year 9 as well, going into the next key stage.
Yeah.
Or starting school, if they're preschool and starting school, that's an important time.
Yeah.
Or if you're looking to change provisions, if something's not working.
Mm-hmm.
So say Callie wasn't working, God forbid, it wasn't working at her school, and you thought, you know what, I'm going to put her into a special needs school, then I suppose that would be where you would come in, someone like yourself.
Yeah.
Where
A review would kind of be triggered at that
Yeah.
point.
And I guess because the setting's different as well, that other things may need to be put in place.
Definitely.
Okay, so to round it up, and it's been really, really interesting, thank you. I think, as we said before, the most asked question, which I know we've covered, but if you could just maybe just give us a couple of things, is if a parent is going to meet an EP, either a school setting, privately, through the LA, what would be the best things that you could advise for them to prepare for this mentally, physically, whether they need to bring anything with?
Yeah.
What could you advise?
I would start by saying, think about who you want in the room, because you do have some say in that as well. Think about, are you wanting to have a conversation just with the EP by themselves?
What would you recommend?
I think there's a good role for having everyone together, but I also respect the fact that sometimes parents want to speak without the school involved. And I equally think that it's important sometimes that teachers can speak to the EP, without the parents there as well. Ideally you'd have a mixture of all of it, of course, but it's what's possible as well.
Sorry, can you leave the room now? I'd like to speak to them now. You leave, I want to speak to them.
But if you feel like actually you've had a joint meeting and you want to speak to them afterwards, say, please can I have a call with you afterwards, and I think most will happily
even through the local authority.
Even through the local authority, absolutely. I'd really love a phone call with you. Could you give me a ring? Can we arrange a time? Ask for it.
Yeah.
The worst they can do is say that
no.
they can't.
Yeah.
But at least you feel like you've asked your questions.
Yeah.
On that note, write down questions that you have. So if you're not understanding something, and it can be about the SEM process that you're going through, it can be about the support that they're getting at school, or it can be about something that's happening at home, or just question, like you say, someone's mentioned the word autism to you and you're like, but what is that? And does my child have it? And how would I know? And write those questions down so you remember to ask them. Think about the child on the best day. Think about when they're really thriving, who they're with, what they're doing, what environments that they're in. How you parent best when things are going well. Yes, we will have moments where we're not parenting at our best, but think about when we are, what is it that makes those moments happen, and try to be able to share that as well.
Try and make it about the child and not about us.
I think so, but I think also don't be fearful of sharing how you're feeling about it as well.
We're definitely not that, are we? We definitely share how we feel.
Yeah, just a bit.
And actually that comes into that wider support for the child. Because we'll often say, like, you can only pour from a full cup, right? You've got to be feeling okay in yourself to provide support for your child. And one of the signposting roles I mentioned at the beginning that we sometimes have is also reading the room and recognising these are parents that you are at a point where you'd like some support with parenting, or wider family circumstances, or whatever that might be. Yeah. And we often, whether we work privately or for the local authority, have those networks.
That's
and
really good to know.
Signpost
really
beyond. So I've, in the past, I've written letters to housing before as part of, following up, or directed to financial services, whatever it might be. So we can.
So you don't have to be alone within this. There is so much that can be help.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for me now, I have the luxury in private practice to say that it really doesn't need to be that one-off, assessment that happens. Yeah. So something that I'm really working towards is trying to support parents on this journey.
Yeah.
And so that's something I'm thinking about going forward is what would I've just sort of launching a package of support for parents.
Love that.
Yeah. Brilliant.
There's not enough of that.
Come and talk to me. Come and have a few sessions. Yep. It's not therapy, but it's solution focused. It's right. Where are you at now?
Yeah.
You have to let us know when that
be the next
happens.
Well, I also feel with any specialist anyway, sorry to interrupt, even if it's a speech therapist, I'm I'm letting it out, and she's just not like, it is therapy. I know it's not therapy, but it is therapy for parents. Oh, it's been a year and she's still only saying a couple of words, you know, and I'm feeling really disheartened by this. Like you do offload to therapists for sure.
Absolutely. And that's the space that we have, and that's okay.
Yeah.
We are trained in that,
Yeah.
you know, hopefully
You
being
have
a
that
compassionate
lovely, calming
listener.
aura.
Yeah,
about
you do.
I'm sitting here like,
I know.
I'm feeling really calm and zen right now.
Yeah. And basically, we're booking you straight after this.
Yeah.
So thank you. No, Gemma, honestly, it's been
I just
been
want to ask you
brilliant.
one more thing before we do go. Why do you love your job so much? What does this job give you?
Yeah.
I know that's quite a hard question.
Firstly,
You're
It
going
is.
you're
I'm
going
really
in with the
going
hard
for it
questions
today.
today.
I'm okay. I'm used to all sorts. Every day's different,
Yeah.
which for me is important because that's how I learn and process. Like, I'm not someone that could do the same job.
I'm sure you've
and
learned
look the
so
same
much from
day in,
these
day out.
children.
Yeah, absolutely. So I like that I'm working with different families, different schools, using different skills every day.
Yeah.
And why do I love it? I love those moments where actually children or teachers or families are just looking at me and just being like, that's it. Like you've
hit the
understood
nail.
my child.
Yeah.
And I know what you say about an hour's observation, but when
Yeah,
parents
yeah.
come back and they just say, you've just got him. Like, I
Yeah.
don't know how you've done it,
Yeah.
but you've just got them. That's going to be really powerful. In the same way, if I'm with a kid and they look at me and
Got goosebumps.
they just say, you know, again, like, yeah, it's just like that. How did you know that's what I found tricky? Or
Must
what
feel
helped
amazing
me?
that
And
you
that's-
kind
very
of making
reassuring.
a difference.
yeah, I like
You're
to think so.
helping someone's family.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We can support along that journey.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's one-off and it's for part of that statutory process, and sometimes it's more ongoing.
That's really rewarding.
Very.
I think
Very.
so.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank
you
you.
so
Thank you
much.
so much for coming.
That's all right. You're welcome.
To get in touch with the fabulous Gemma,
You can contact her via Instagram, Facebook, and her website, Handelsman Psychology.